Okay, let's unpack this. We've got some truly fascinating source material for this deep dive. We're looking at excerpts from Anton LaVey's The Satanic Bible. Our mission today is to dig into this specific text you've shared, explore its core ideas, philosophy, and the practices it describes, and really try to understand what sets LaVey's approach apart, according to his own words in these excerpts.
That's right. And from the outset, it's crucial to frame this correctly. Our job here isn't to evaluate, endorse, or critique these ideas from an external perspective.
Yeah.
It's solely about diving into the source material you've provided, pulling out the most important nuggets, and helping you understand what is in this book.
Exactly.
It's a topic that carries a lot of baggage and can be controversial, but we're focusing objectively on the ideas themselves as presented in this text.
Exactly. So let's jump right in by setting the historical stage, based only on what the source tells us. Who was Anton LaVey, and what was the origin of the Church of Satan he founded?
Well, the source introduces Anton LaVey initially as someone with a background in the circus and carnival, specifically mentioning him as a former lion tamer and, interestingly, a trickster.
A trickster. Yes.
Yeah, the text indicates the researcher approaching him wasn't sure what to expect, weighing whether he might be a prankster, a quack, or a genuine Satanist, and contrasting him with other occult figures perceived as, less authentic or maybe phonies.
So someone with a flair for the dramatic, perhaps, and coming from a world of performance.
Seems like it. And the source points to some key things he and his organization did that were seen as pretty revolutionary at the time.
Right. What were those?
Yes. Two main innovations are highlighted. First, they boldly chose to represent themselves as a church.
A church.
Yes. The source calls this blasphemous because up until then, that term was almost exclusively associated with Christian denominations, right? Not with occult groups or covens. It was a very deliberate choice.
That choice immediately shifts the perception, doesn't it? It claims a certain institutional legitimacy or framework, even while embracing a concept traditionally opposed to the church.
It certainly gives it a different weight than, say, calling it a simple coven or study group. Definitely.
And the second innovation?
Equally striking. They practiced what they called black magic openly rather than secretly underground.
Openly.
This public declaration and practice was a significant departure from the secretive nature often assumed of such activities.
Practicing it openly, that takes a certain amount of audaciousness, especially given the cultural context. And when did this officially begin, according to the text?
The source marks the founding on Walpurgisnacht, April 30th, 1966.
Walpurgisnacht, okay.
That date is noted as a major traditional festival in the lore of magic. LaVey ritualistically shaved his head on this night, which the text notes as following a magical tradition, and put on a clerical collar, identifying himself as a minister of this newly formed church.
And the text gives a really vivid description of his appearance at that point, capturing that blend of traditional religious imagery and something quite different.
It does. It says that from the collar up, he looked almost holy, but the combination of his shaved head, his Mephistophelian beard, and narrow eyes created, well, the necessary demonic look for his priesthood of the devil's church on earth.
Wow.
It was a carefully constructed image combining elements of authority with a deliberately provocative appearance.
Fascinating how he seemed to understand and utilize visual symbolism. Beyond just founding the church, the source mentions other activities LaVey was involved in. What did he delve into?
Well, the source says he connected with remnants of pre-war European occult fraternities,
Okay.
drawing on their philosophies and acquiring secret rituals from the era before Hitler. He dedicated time to studying, writing, and formulating new principles.
So research and development, basically.
You could say that. He also experimented with and applied geometric spatial concepts, which he referred to as the law of the trapezoid, while dismissing other faddists.
The law of the trapezoid. That sounds quite specific and perhaps unique to his system.
It suggests a structured, almost geometric approach to certain principles, contrasting it with more generalized or less rigorous esoteric ideas.
And beyond the study.
Beyond study, he became a public figure, sought after as a speaker, appearing on radio and television. He was also significantly involved as a production and technical advisor for filmmakers creating satanic chillers. and even acted in some of them.
So the source is saying he had a direct hand in shaping how cinematic Satanism was portrayed for audiences.
Absolutely. The text highlights his direct impact on formulaic cinematic presentations of Satanism.
Right.
The focus on ritual and esoteric symbolism, which were central to his church's practice, became prominent elements in these films.
Interesting parallel.
Yeah, the source draws a parallel here, suggesting that just as ritual in the church aims to focus the emotional powers within each individual, the ornate ritualism in the films he advised on served to involve and focus the emotional experience of the cinema audience.
That's a compelling connection. Seeing the cinematic use of ritual as mirroring its psychological function within his system.
Right.
It implies a deep understanding of how symbolic action impacts emotional states, whether in a ritual chamber or a movie theater.
It certainly points to a pragmatic view of ritual and its power applied across different contexts. The source also notes that his writing, particularly the Satanic Bible, played a major role in the worldwide growth of Church of Satan membership.
Makes sense. Books travel.
They do.
And as this brand of Satanism gained visibility, what kind of reaction did it provoke from more traditional religious groups, according to the text?
Well, the source describes scare stories emerging from religious circles. These groups complained that the Satanic Bible was reportedly outselling the Christian Bible on college campuses and was a primary reason young people were turning away from God.
So, moral panic territory.
Pretty much. The text also suggests that when Pope Paul VI issued a proclamation stating the devil is alive and a person, a living fire-breathing character, it's suspected he may have specifically had LaVey in mind, given the timing and the context.
Being the subject of a papal proclamation definitely underscores the level of attention and perceived threat. How did LaVey respond to these religious claims and the Pope?
According to the source, LaVey's response was quite direct. He maintained that evil is simply live, spelled backward.
Ah, the wordplay.
And that this evil or live should not be feared or suppressed, but actively indulged in and enjoyed. It's a linguistic play used to frame a core philosophical stance directly opposing traditional religious views.
Okay, that sets the stage for who he was and how the church emerged, based on these excerpts. Now let's get into the heart of the philosophy laid out in the books of Satan and Lucifer. It sounds like a fundamental rejection and inversion of many traditional ethical and spiritual ideas.
It absolutely is. The text states that the motivation for writing the Satanic Bible stems from a critique of existing occult and magic literature,
Right.
which LaVey views as, and I quote, sanctimonious fraud, guilt-ridden ramblings, and esoteric gibberish.
Strong words.
Very. He believes these older texts were written by chroniclers unable or unwilling to be objective and were a byproduct of brains festering with fear and defeat, unknowingly serving those who really rule the earth.
So he sees a need to cut through hypocrisy and present a more honest, objective view, even if it challenges established norms.
Exactly. He aims to present satanic thought from a truly satanic point of view. The preface notes that the book contains truth and fantasy, stating that each is necessary for the other to exist, but each must be recognized for what it is.
Truth and fantasy, okay?
Yeah.
The prologue describes an age of Satan. What is the significance of this declaration in the text?
It's framed as a turning point. The prologue announces that the gods of the right-hand path, the traditional spiritual religions, have had their day, they've bickered, and their millennium is done.
Their time is up.
Essentially, it declares the twilight is done, and Lucifer is risen once more to proclaim, this is the age of Satan. Satan rules the earth. This new era is presented as the morning of magic and undefiled wisdom.
Undefiled wisdom being implicitly contrasted with the wisdom of the traditional religions he's critiquing.
Precisely. It's positioned as wisdom that isn't corrupted by self-denial or spiritual dogma. The prologue is quite explicit about the focus of this age. The flesh prevaileth, and a great church shall be builded, consecrated in its name.
The flesh prevails.
Yes. It asserts that man's salvation isn't dependent on self-denial, and that the world of the flesh and the living shall be the greatest preparation for any and all eternal delights.
So the focus shifts entirely from preparing for a spiritual afterlife by rejecting the physical world to embracing the physical world as the ultimate reality and preparation for whatever may come.
It grounds existence and value firmly in the tangible material world and human experience. Now, a critical point that the text makes is LaVey's definition of Satan itself.
And how is that defined? It's not the common conception, according to the source.
No, it's not presented as a literal fire-breathing deity. LaVey's Satan is described as a symbol.
A symbol.
The source states he is the spirit of progress, the inspirer of all great movements that contribute to the development of civilization and the advancement of mankind.
Okay.
He is the spirit of revolt that leads to freedom, the embodiment of all heresies that liberate. This is explicitly presented as a contrast to the Christian depiction of Satan as purely evil.
So Satan symbolizes dynamic forces, progress, rebellion, challenging dogma, seeking freedom rather than a personified entity to be worshipped.
Exactly. He represents those disruptive, advancing aspects of human endeavor and thought. The Book of Satan itself is introduced as a statement of diabolical indignation.
Diabolical indignation.
Yes. The text argues that the devil has been unfairly attacked by men of God for centuries without having a voice except, in fiction.
Framing it as a justified counterattack against centuries of condemnation.
What? Yes. The text claims that Christian talk of charity towards Satan is an empty sham because, allegorically, Satan's role is essential to their religious narrative without a powerful adversary. Their concept of God and salvation would collapse.
Interesting point.
It states Satan has been the gentleman, allowing this, but now it's time to shout back and demand his due, rejecting the ponderous rulebooks of hypocrisy.
That brings us to the core tenets presented in the Book of Satan. What are some of the key declarations that define this philosophy?
The text lists several powerful statements. There's a strong assertion of individual autonomy and rejection of external control. Before none of your printed idols do I bend in acquiescence, and he who saith, thou shalt to me is my mortal foe.
Very defiant.
Extremely. It rejects the traditional redeemer figure, describing it as dipping a finger in his watery blood and writing the true prince of evil, the king of slaves, on his brow.
That language is incredibly defiant and directly challenges the central figure of Christianity.
It's meant to be provocative. The text also rejects falsehood and blind adherence. No hoary falsehood shall be a truth to me. No stifling dogma shall encramp my pen.
Oh.
The focus is explicitly placed on earthly success and happiness. I break away from all conventions that do not lead to my earthly success and happiness. It champions raising the standard of the strong and even directly challenges the concept of Jehovah. I gaze into the glassy eye of your fearsome Jehovah and pluck him by the beard.
Wow. These are explicit rejections of fundamental religious figures and concepts, prioritizing individual well-being and strength in the present life. The critique of traditional morality is central here, isn't it? Particularly the idea of turning the other cheek.
It's a major point presented in later sections of the Book of Satan. The text challenges the authority of love one another, asking, upon what rational authority does the gospel of love rest? Why should I not hate mine enemies?
Good question from that perspective.
It questions if it's truly natural for enemies to wish good upon each other and asks pointedly, and what is good?
So instead of love and forgiveness,
the text advocates for embracing hate and revenge. It states, hate your enemies with a whole heart, and if a man smite you on one cheek, smash him on the other.
smash it.
Smite him hip and thigh, for self-preservation is the highest law. He who turns the other cheek is called a cowardly dog.
No ambiguity there.
None. The text encourages reciprocity and escalation. Give blow for blow, scorn for scorn, doom for doom, with compound interest liberally added thereunto. Eye for eye, tooth for tooth, eye fourfold, 100-fold.
That's a stark contrast to traditional religious ethics.
Yeah.
And the text frames this as leading to respect, with your immortal spirit living on in the brains and sinews of those whose respect you have gained.
Yes, it grounds the idea of legacy and influence in tangible results and the impression you make on those around you in this life.
Right.
The text also critiques dead custom and false prophets, stating, too long the dead hand has been permitted to sterilize living thought, and too long right and wrong, good and evil have been inverted by false prophets.
It seems to empower the individual to question established religious and moral systems.
Explicitly, no creed must be accepted upon authority of a divine nature. Religions and moral dogma must be questioned because the text states there is nothing inherently sacred about moral codes. Like the wooden idols of long ago, they are the work of human hands, and what man has made, man can destroy.
That's a powerful statement asserting the human origin and mutability of moral frameworks. What about the role of belief versus doubt?
The source puts a high value on skepticism, stating, he that is slow to believe anything and everything is of great understanding, for belief in one false principle is the beginning of all in wisdom.
So doubt is good?
Doubt is essential in this view. It emphasizes critical thinking and a cautious approach to accepting claims.
And adaptability in the face of change seems important too.
It is. The text notes, as environments change, no human ideal standeth sure. It advocates for actively destroying lies and sophisms for prosperity and nobility of thought, saying alleged truth proven empty must be unceremoniously flung into the outer darkness.
Like taking out the trash.
Pretty much. These popular lies are seen as detrimental to personal freedom.
Yes, they are presented as enemies of personal liberty. The source calls for dealing with them decisively. Cut them out to the very core, just as cancers. Exterminate them, root and branch. Annihilate them, or they will us. It's a call to relentless intellectual and philosophical warfare against what is seen as harmful falsehood. Intense. The Book of Satan also includes its own version of Beatitudes, which is a striking parallel to Christian scripture in form, but radically different in content.
Indeed. Book of Satan V presents these inversions. Blessed are the strong, the powerful, the destroyers of false hope, called true messiahs.
Yeah.
The valiant, those who believe in what is best for themselves, the man with enemies, and the mighty-minded.
And the cursed.
Conversely, cursed are the weak, the feeble, the God-adorers, shorn sheep, believers in good and evil, frightened by shadows. The lambs of God shall be bled whiter than snow.
Oof.
He who does good to those who snare shall be despised, and the weak whose insecurity makes them vile shall serve and suffer.
This is a complete and unapologetic inversion of traditional religious virtues, celebrating strength, self-interest, and earthly power, while condemning weakness and traditional humility.
It's a clear statement prioritizing self-preservation and power over traditional selflessness. The section concludes with, the angel of self-deceit is camped in the souls of the righteous. The eternal flame of power through joy dwelleth within the flesh of the Satanist.
Power through joy within the flesh.
This explicitly links the Satanist identity to internal power and the joy derived from embracing their true nature.
Moving on to the Book of Lucifer. The text titles this section, The Enlightenment. How does it frame the figure of Lucifer?
Lucifer is presented not as the Christian devil, but in his original Roman sense as the bearer of light, the spirit of the air, the personification of enlightenment.
The light bringer.
Exactly. The text argues that Christian mythology made him synonymous with evil due to clouded definitions and bogus values. The purpose of this book, it says, is to set the record straight regarding these false moralisms and occult inaccuracies.
So Lucifer represents light, knowledge, and exposing deception. And the source makes a surprising claim about truth and doubt.
It counters the idea that the truth will make men free, stating this is false. Instead, it asserts, it is only doubt which will bring mental emancipation.
Doubt brings freedom, not truth.
That's the claim. Doubt is presented as the necessary doorway through which truth can enter. The text then reinterprets the Christian scripture calling the devil the father of lies as a magnificent example of character inversion.
So?
Arguing that if the devil represents falsehood, then he, not God, must have established all spiritual religions and who wrote all of the scriptures.
Whoa! That's a radical flip, suggesting traditional religions are founded on lies propagated by the very figure they demonize.
It completely subverts the conventional narrative. The text also rejects hope and prayer, viewing them as signs of apprehension. The Satanist, according to the source, doesn't hope or pray. They act in a positive way which will make it happen, taking control instead of waiting or asking for divine intervention.
Action over hope.
Right. Praying for forgiveness is called useless and degrading, and the text cynically notes people confess to clear their conscience so they can be free to go out and sin again.
So, dismissing prayer and confession as either passive or hypocritical, the text also critiques the different interpretations of God across religions and the resulting conflict.
It highlights the vast spectrum of God concepts, from universal cosmic mind to an anthropomorphic figure, and points out how different religions and even sects within them label each other as heretics despite claiming to worship the same ultimate force.
Yeah, history's full of that.
It gives examples like Catholic versus Protestant damnation claims, or evangelical groups calling Catholics heathens, while noting the historical labeling of Jews with the devil's name.
It sees hypocrisy when religions pray for one another, too.
Yes, the source calls this a simperingly polite way of saying, I hate your guts.
Oh, okay.
It describes it as bargain basement anger disguised as prayer. The text uses this discrepancy to question the very authority of any single religious claim, asking if there's so much violent disagreement on how to worship, how many different interpretations of God can there be and who is right?
A fundamental question. It also critiques the concept of deathbed absolution.
The text notes the conventional religious concern with pleasing God for the afterlife, contrasted with the availability of last-minute absolution.
The get-out-of-jail-free card.
Sort of. It contrasts this with the Yazidis, a group mentioned in the source, who allegedly believe God is all-powerful and forgiving, so they focus on pleasing the devil, who rules earthly life, trusting God will forgive them eventually. This is presented as a more pragmatic, albeit unconventional, approach.
Interesting take. The text uses the term Christian atheists and points out contradictions within Christianity itself.
It asserts that Christian scriptures are a mass of contradictions and calls the term Christian atheist inherently contradictory. It questions how followers can adhere to previous tradition if leaders reject old interpretations, adding the cynical quip about God needing Medicare if he isn't dead.
Ouch. And this leads to a core concept in the text. The God you save may be yourself.
This is a central tenet presented in the source. It argues that all spiritual religions are essentially human inventions where man externalizes his own ego into a god.
Externalizes the ego.
Yes. This invented god is then given powers and freedoms denied to man, killing, performing miracles, controlling others without responsibility. The source argues that worshiping this externalized god is equivalent to worshiping by proxy the man that invented God.
So man creates God in his own image, then worships that creation instead of recognizing the divine potential within himself.
That's the argument. The text asks why one should fear, praise, or remain separate from this God if it's merely an externalized version of your own true self.
Right.
It suggests that closing this gap reveals the demon of pride, or Lucifer, and man sees the carnal and spiritual as one, realizing they are only carnal and always were.
Only carnal.
At this point, the text states he either hates himself or rejoices.
If he hates himself, he seeks more spiritual paths to try and split himself again.
Yes, to scourge his poor, miserable shell.
Yeah.
But if he accepts this truth, the text argues, he recognizes that the tools used by invented religions, ritual and ceremony, which were used to sustain faith in a lie, can now be used to sustain faith in the truth of his own majestic being.
So repurposing religious tools for self-affirmation.
Exactly. It's about repurposing the tools of religion for radical self-affirmation.
And the source claims that moving away from God is actually moving closer to the devil.
It states that as religious faith wanes and man becomes closer to himself and farther from God, he becomes closer to the devil as a symbol of the self. If he fully embraces this, living in the devil's vein, with sinews of Satan moving in his flesh, he will either escape the righteous or manipulate the masses through his satanic might until he can proudly proclaim, "I am a Satanist. Bow down, for I am the highest."
Yeah. That's the ultimate declaration of self-worship and earthly power.
It's a stark vision of prioritizing the individual's power and identity above all else.
It really is. Let's shift now to satanic magic, which the text covers in the book of Belial and Leviathan, focusing on the mastery of the earth.
That's the title of the Book of Belial section. The source begins by criticizing existing occultists for making magic overly esoteric and complex, like maze makers.
The makers.
Yeah. It argues this makes the student a victim of the very art of misdirection, which he himself should be employing. The text uses the analogy of a psychology student who knows all the theory but can't make friends.
The classic example.
Emphasizing that magic should be practical.
So a call for a practical, effective approach, rather than complex theoretical systems. The source also addresses the common distinction between white and black magic.
It argues there's no difference, except for the smug hypocrisy, guilt-ridden righteousness, and self-deceit of the white magician himself.
Okay, so hypocrisy is the only difference.
According to this text, yes. White magic is defined as for altruistic good purposes, black for self-aggrandizement, personal power fell. The source claims that everyone pursuing occult studies has ego gratification and personal power as a goal. The difference is just whether they are honest about it.
And good and evil are subjective.
Presented as entirely subjective, yes. It strips away the moral layering and claims the underlying motivation is always personal gain, just framed differently.
It's framed as a matter of honesty about one's true desires.
Exactly. The source then defines magic itself, causing change in accordance with one's will. It divides magic into two categories.
And what are those?
First, greater magic, which is ritual or ceremonial. This is a formal ceremony in a specific place and time.
Right.
Its function is described as isolating emotional energy, like adrenaline, and converting it into a dynamically transmittable force. This is purely emotional during the ritual, with intellectual planning happening before.
So ritual is a tool for focusing and channeling intense emotional energy as a force for change.
Yes, that's the mechanism described. The second category is lesser magic, which is non-ritual or manipulative.
Lesser magic.
This involves wile and guile obtained through various devices and contrived situations. The text notes older names like fascination, glamour, or the evil eye.
The source connects glamour and fascination back to historical witch trials, offering an interesting reinterpretation.
It suggests that while many accused witches were innocent, the real witches were skilled in enchantment and charm. It claims this is the origin of glamour, which originally meant witchcraft, describing the modern witch's key asset as her ability to be alluring or to utilize glamour. Similarly, fascination was linked to the evil eye. Fixing someone's gaze was seen as cursing them, and a woman's ability to fascinate men was considered proof she was a witch.
So traditional concepts of charm or captivating attention are reframed as forms of magical influence in this system.
Pretty much, yeah. Lesser magic, the manipulative kind, is said to involve a command to look.
The command to look.
Yes, because manipulating someone requires attracting and holding their attention. The source lists 3 primary methods for this, or combinations: sex, sentiment, and wonder.
Okay, break this down. Sex.
Sex involves using physical attractiveness or sex appeal as a tool, noting its power, especially for women, according to the text.
Sentiment.
This applies to using a comforting or eccentric persona, often associated with older individuals like the cookie lady, using fantasy for children, or the sweet old grandpa image for misdirection, or an elfin or forest wizard figure offering sage advice, kind of archetype manipulation.
And wonder.
This involves using a strange or awesome appearance to manipulate through fear. By making a strange appearance work for her, a person can manipulate others simply because they are, quote, fearful of the consequences should they not do as she asks.
So leveraging fear.
Right. The text stresses evaluating one's assets and using the appropriate method.
So it's about leveraging different personal qualities, from allure to an intimidating presence, to gain influence over others, framed as magical manipulation. The source also discusses the role of odor.
Yes, it notes that smell is used by animals for judgment and motivation, and even humans are still unconsciously influenced by it.
Primal stuff.
Very. It suggests using natural secretions to contrast with social politeness, for men trying to enchant, and for women not fearing natural odors. That place between your thighs is not dry and sterile, as they are natural sexual stimulants which nature has provided.
A very primal, almost animalistic perspective on attraction and influence. Let's delve more into greater magic, the ritual. The source outlines 3 types of satanic ritual based on the emotional drive.
The 3 types correspond to fundamental human desires. First, the sex ritual, a love charm spell, aiming to create desire in a target or summon a partner.
Okay.
It requires strong personal desire culminating in orgasm to be successful. It's distinguished from enchantment for other goals and is said to be best performed privately.
The second type.
The compassion ritual, or sentiment ritual, performed to help oneself or others with things like health, success, or business. The source includes genuine charity here, but frames it with, charity begins at home.
Right.
Like sex rituals, these are said to be most effective privately.
And the third type.
The destruction ritual, fueled by negative emotions like anger, hate, or contempt. It's a hex or curse used against deserving victims.
Deserving victim.
Yes. The text notes that these rituals can benefit from group intensity, perhaps due to shared anger or lack of embarrassment in expressing destructive intent.
So the type of ritual is determined by the emotional energy being channeled, lust, compassion, or hate anger. This brings us to a fascinating point. Receptivity to magic, particularly curses. The source makes a counterintuitive claim about belief.
This is where it gets really interesting. The source asserts that the success of a ritual depends on the recipient's receptivity. For sex and compassion rituals, belief and faith help.
Okay, that makes sense.
However, for curses and hexes, non-belief is more receptive.
Wait, what? So the source is saying skepticism actually makes you more vulnerable to a curse. That seems completely upside down. How did the text explain that?
It explains that a believer, like an uncivilized tribesman, is consciously aware of the threat of a curse and takes precautions or seeks counter magic. They were, watching his step.
Right.
The enlightened skeptic, however, dismisses magic as superstition, pushing the fear of it into their unconscious.
The unconscious fear.
Exactly. The source argues that this unconscious fear, deprived of conscious defense, nourishes a destructive force. The conscious denial of magical significance actually creates accident-prone situations where misfortunes multiply.
So you manifest your own bad luck because you're repressing the fear.
That's the mechanism described. The skeptic calls these coincidences, but the magician is satisfied because the results occur in accordance with your will. The fear operates below the surface, unchecked.
Wow.
The text links this to man's fundamental fear of the unknown, calling it a first cousin to fascination. It notes that this fear drives logical men to seek explanations and motivates scientists through wonder, but laments that the man who calls himself logical is often the last to recognize the essence of ritual magic.
It uses the analogy of stigmata, right?
Yes. If religious faith can cause physical manifestations like bleeding wounds, extreme compassion, why doubt the destructive power of extreme fear and terror, which it suggests explains the power of demons?
And there's a specific warning about dealing with a skeptic you wish to curse.
Yes, the text gives a firm warning. Never try to convince a skeptic you mean to curse them. Allow them to scoff.
Let them laugh it off.
Right. Enlightening them lessens the chance of success. It's their scoffing, combined with inner turmoil caused by unconscious fear, that leads to their destruction. The text grimly concludes, if he is despicable enough, by Satan's grace, he might even die laughing.
That paints a chilling picture of how a destruction ritual is intended to work, leveraging the target's own psychological state.
Now let's look at the ritual chamber itself, which the source interestingly calls the intellectual decompression chamber.
The text describes magical ceremony as either individual or group. Group rituals, it says, reinforce faith and instill power by bringing together people with a common philosophy, renewing confidence.
Strength in numbers.
And destruction rituals particularly benefit from group intensity, as anger and symbolic destruction are key and potential embarrassment isn't an issue.
But private rituals are often preferred for sex and compassion, the source notes. Yes, because compassion rituals might involve unashamed shedding of tears, and sex rituals have masturbatory and orgasmic overtones. These types are said to succeed best privately due to the potential for self-consciousness, unless that self-consciousness is deliberately incorporated into a role.
The term intellectual decompression chamber is quite telling about the perceived function of the ritual space.
The text describes it as a training school for temporary ignorance, as are all religious services.
All religious services.
That's the claim. The key difference, it asserts, is that the Satanist knows they are practicing a form of contrived ignorance to expand their will and release suppressed emotions. Other religionists, it claims, practice self-deceit or are too psychologically fragile to admit to self-imposed ignorance.
So the Satanist goes in aware they are engaging in a psychological tool, while followers of other religions might believe they are genuinely interacting with an external divine force.
That's the distinction drawn in the text. It then outlines the 13 steps of the satanic ritual, noting preliminary conditions like facing west towards the altar and positioning the altar correctly.
Let's look at some of the key elements and steps described.
The steps involve preparing the space and oneself, dressing, assembling devices, lighting candles, shutting out light, setting up the altar, potentially a woman.
The woman is the altar.
Yes, that's mentioned. Purifying the air with a bell and reading invocations. A core part is reading the invocation to Satan and infernal names aloud, often with participants repeating them. There's drinking from a chalice and turning counterclockwise to call the princes of hell associated with the cardinal points: Satan south, Lucifer east, Belial north, and Leviathan west.
Calling the corners, basically, but with these specific figures.
Right. A benediction with a phallus is mentioned for group rituals.
And then reading the specific invocation for lust, compassion, or destruction. Step 10 seems critical for the emotional release.
It's described as extremely important for personalized rituals and releasing energy. This is where you move away from the altar to a space for working and fashion imagery, using the five senses, paralleling the desired situation.
Using all senses.
For a lust ritual, this involves intense sexual feeling culminating in the strongest possible orgasm, often using masturbatory or autoerotic means as the climax.
Okay.
For a destruction ritual, it's intense, calculated hatred and disdain, vividly destroying the target by proxy until exhaustion. The compassion ritual follows a similar structure of intense emotional focus.
So it's about generating and directing peak emotional states, intense lust, rage, or fervent desire for well-being, and channeling that energy through symbolic action.
Yes, those peak emotional releases are presented as the engine of the magic. The final steps involve dealing with requests written on parchment, burning them in candle flames, black for blessings, white for curses.
Specific candle colors for intent.
and repeating requests after the priests. An Enochian key signifying allegiance is read, and the bell is rung again as a pollutionary to mark the end, followed by, "So it is done."
The text also details various ingredients used in the rituals and their symbolism. What are some of the key items mentioned?
There are several items with specific symbolic or functional roles. Clothing is important. Males wear black robes or clothing for anonymity and focus, while females wear sexually suggestive clothing to stimulate males and intensify energy, or black if older.
Interesting gender distinction there.
Amulets like the Baphomet sigil or a pentagram are worn. Black symbolizes the powers of darkness. The single white candle represents the hypocrisy of white light magic.
The altar itself has a specific description.
The text notes that early altars were living flesh and were later perverted by religions into stone or metal. In satanic ritual, a woman can be used as the altar, positioned with her head south and feet north, with other devices placed nearby.
The Baphomet symbol sounds very important.
It's described as central, used by the Knights Templar, and known by names like the Goat of Mendes or the Scapegoat. It represents the powers of darkness combined with the generative fertility of the goat.
The goat imagery.
Right. The inverted pentagram is described as fitting the goat's head, with the horns representing duality and defiance, and the inverted points denying the Trinity. Hebraic figures spell Leviathan, linked to Satan. It's placed above the altar.
Other items like candles, bell, chalice.
Candles represent the light of Lucifer, enlightenment, and desire. Only black and white are used. The bell shatters or clears the air at the start and intensifies the working at the end. The chalice, ideally silver, is the chalice of ecstasy, holding a stimulating fluid, the elixir of life, not wine, to relax and intensify emotions.
Not just wine.
No, the sword of power, is an aggressive force used to point at Baphomet, call the princes of hell, and interact with parchments. A phallus is a pagan fertility symbol used for benediction in group rituals. A gong calls the powers of darkness in group rituals. Parchment is used for writing request curses to be burned, sending them into the ether.
These items all seem designed to enhance the emotional and symbolic intensity of the ritual, focusing the will and energy. The Book of Leviathan focuses on the verbal component, the invocations and keys.
Yes, the text states that soaring emotional states can be reached through verbal communication, turning words into monuments to thoughts. It emphasizes that the emotional response generated by the words is crucial for a successful working.
The feeling behind the words.
Exactly. It mentions an anecdote of an old wizard who ad-libbed poetry to keep the emotional energy flowing.
It provides examples of these verbal components, including Enochian keys.
It gives examples like the male invocation, "My rod is a thrust," an invocation of compassion asking for help against an adversary and restoration to joy, invoked in the name of Satan.
Okay.
It summarizes the purported functions of several Enochian keys. They seem linked to establishing structure, expressing wrath and vengeance, promoting sexual desire and pleasure, strength through joy, bitter sting, recognizing earthly realities and bringing enlightenment through revelation.
Strength through joy again.
Yes, that phrase pops up. The 18th key is noted as opening the gates of hell and casting up Lucifer's blessing, again linking back to strength through joy as a great secret of truth.
And there's a general admonition presented in partial English translation at the end of the excerpt, which sounds quite stark.
It's a powerful passage addressing pleasures which dwell in the first air, calling them mighty and commanding them to execute the judgment of the mighty. It includes lines like, "Behold the face of Satan, strength through joy, the reasonable creatures, and men, let them vex and weed out one another.
Weed each other out.
The work of man and his pomp, let them be defaced. His buildings, let them become caves." It culminates in a statement of regret from the speaking entity. "Confound her understanding with darkness. For why? It repenteth me that I have made man in the bed of a harlot, in the dwelling place of Lucifer the king."
That passage certainly reinforces the themes of judgment, destruction of human constructs, and a deep dissatisfaction with humanity stemming from a powerful, non-human perspective.
It provides a voice for the critical, judging perspective that is central to this philosophy, framed from the symbolic viewpoint of the powers of darkness.
Okay, we've explored the philosophy and the theory and practice of magic according to this text. Now let's look at some specific applications and critiques presented, starting with the Black Mass, about which the source has some strong opinions.
It does. The source first describes the popular lurid image. A nude woman as altar, candles from baby fat, urine blood chalice, inverted cross, ergot hosts, backwards prayers, flagellation, hindquarters kissing, baby sacrifice.
The whole 9 yards of sensationalism.
Exactly. This is the common conception it aims to deconstruct. The source then delivers a strong critique.
What does it say about this traditional image?
The source declares it a literary invention, nothing more.
Just made up.
That's the claim. It argues it was created as a propaganda by the church to scare people into remaining devout by falsely portraying the blasphemies of heretics. It was also used as a source of revenue, like charging baptism fees by spreading scare stories about babies being stolen for sacrifices.
Wow. Cynical.
The text even suggests it served as an outlet for the lewd thoughts of writers and artists, claiming the Vatican has the most complete library of pornography.
So the Black Mass, as commonly understood, is presented as a fabricated horror story for control and profit.
That's the text's assertion. It also re-examines the oscularum infamy, kiss of shame, or kissing the devil's behind.
Right, the infamous kiss.
It reinterprets this not as a literal act of perversion, but as a symbolic act, a forerunner of the modern term for appealing to ego for material gain.
Like kissing up.
Essentially, yeah. It's seen as a symbolic requisite towards earthly rather than spiritual success.
That reframes a seemingly grotesque act into a cynical view of how worldly power is often gained through flattery or appealing to ego.
Yes, giving it a pragmatic, albeit critical, interpretation. Crucially, the source states that the Black Mass is not the core satanic ritual.
Not the main event.
According to the text, a Satanist would use it only as psychodrama, a parody of the Roman Catholic service or any other religious ceremony.
And it argues this is actually redundant for Satanists.
The text makes the case that the services of all established religions are already parodies of older, more naturalistic pagan rites having been desexualized and dehumanized. The conventional churchgoer in this view unknowingly attends their own Black Mass, spoofing honest pagan rites.
So mainstream religion is seen as already being a hypocritical, watered-down version of older practices that were more aligned with natural instincts.
That's the argument presented. The source suggests that a modern Black Mass, if performed, would need to shock and outrage modern sensibilities, as the church itself is no longer the sole source of sacred authority.
So parody modern targets.
Thus, a modern parody might target institutions like Eastern mysticism, psychiatry, the psychedelic movement, or ultraliberalism. It could champion patriotism, defile drugs or gurus, deify cultural rebels, or even ironically boost decadent religious theologies. The Satanic Magus is seen as a catalyst for dichotomy, disrupting perceived norms.
Interesting.
The text mentions historical uses of Black Mass accounts, like in 1666 France by Lavoisin for her illicit businesses.
It suggests using shock and inversion deliberately to challenge modern conventions, just as the traditional Black Mass was said to parody the church. The text also draws a sharp distinction between real and pseudo-Satanists.
It claims the pseudo-Satanist is the one who conforms to the popular image, focusing on the sensational Black Mass. But the real Satanist is not quite so easily recognized.
The hidden ones.
The source suggests it would be an oversimplification to say every successful person is a Satanist without knowing it, but that the thirst for earthly success and its ensuing realization are certainly grounds for St. Peter turning thumbs down.
It directly links worldly success and ambition to the Satanic philosophy.
Yes. It states that if the love of money is the root of all evil, then the most powerful men on earth, listing financiers, industrialists, popes, poets, dictators, opinion makers, must be the most satanic.
Controversial claim.
Very. It views historical mystery men like Rasputin or Cagliostro as clues to the true legacy of Satan, a legacy described as transcending ethnic, racial, economic, and ideological differences.
So the true Satanist is seen as a powerful, successful individual living by this philosophy, regardless of their label, often operating behind the scenes.
That's the implication. The text asserts the Satanist has always ruled the earth, and always will, by whatever name he is called. It claims the standards, philosophy, and practices presented in the book are those employed by the most self-realized and powerful humans on earth, and that the potential of the Satanist resides in the secret thoughts of each man and woman, still motivated by sound and unclouded minds.
This connects the philosophy to a pragmatic, power-oriented approach to life, one that is perhaps lived by influential individuals across history. Let's move to satanic sex, a topic often associated with this system, but the source suggests common misconceptions exist.
It does. The source explicitly states that the common assumption that sexual activity is the most important factor, and that orgies are a prerequisite, is nothing could be farther from the truth.
Okay, debunking the myth.
Opportunists focused solely on the sexual aspects are emphatically discouraged.
So it's not just about indiscriminate sexual indulgence. What is the satanic concept of sexual freedom presented in the text?
The source defines it specifically as freedom to either be faithful to one person or to indulge your sexual desires with as many others as you feel is necessary to satisfy your particular needs.
Choice and need.
It's about individual needs and choice, not being driven by compulsion or external pressure. It warns against forcing oneself into promiscuity if it feels unnatural, or leaving needs unfulfilled due to guilt.
It critiques those who are constantly preoccupied with demonstrating their sexual emancipation.
It argues they're actually in greater sexual bondage than those who accept sex naturally. The text uses the example of a nymphomaniac, described as often frigid and roving due to inhibition, not freedom. Group sex norms are also criticized for often suppressing individual preferences or deviant activity, described as forced, mechanical, and regimented, stating uniformity is not freedom.
So genuine sexual freedom, in this view, includes embracing any individual preference or fetish, as long as it meets a certain condition.
Yes. Satanism, according to the text, condones any sexual activity satisfying individual desires, hetero, homo, bi, asex, and any fetish or deviation if it harms no one unwilling.
If it harms no one unwilling, that's key.
Yes. The source notes the high prevalence of deviant fetishistic behavior, often hidden, and argues most people have some fetish but feel depraved due to lack of awareness.
That condition of consent seems crucial.
It's stated clearly. So long as it hurts no one unwilling. The text clarifies this doesn't include the unintentional hurt felt by others who are offended by your views due to their own anxieties or morality.
So someone else's offense doesn't negate your freedom.
Right. It suggests avoiding offending prudish friends' relatives if they are truly important to you. But if they are hurt despite reasonable efforts, you should feel no guilt. There's no purpose in flaunting permissiveness.
But if all parties are willing, even in unconventional or taboo acts.
The text states, if all parties involved are mature adults who willingly take full responsibility for their actions and voluntarily engage in a given form of sexual expression, then there is no reason for them to repress their sexual inclinations.
Okay.
It emphasizes being aware of the implications and being certain your actions hurt no one who doesn't wish or deserve to be hurt.
Deserve. The source also touches on the variety of individual sexual tastes.
It compares it to diet tastes and appetites very greatly. It asserts no person or society has the right to limit another's sexual standards or frequency. Proper conduct is judged individually. What works for one may frustrate another. It's deemed unjust to belittle others' capacity or impose your own, suggesting that if one partner has a much lower appetite, they should accept the other partner finding release elsewhere, including autoerotic practices.
That brings us to masturbation, which the source calls an extremely important ingredient of many a successful magical working.
It notes that masturbation is often a taboo that creates guilt. The source traces the stigma back to the misinterpretation of the sin of Onan in the Judeo-Christian Bible and the exaggerated claims of negative consequences in 19th century texts.
The old myths.
Right. While modern sexologists have intellectually removed the stigma, the text argues deep-seated guilt remains, passed down through generations. The myth of going insane from masturbation is dismissed, explained by asylum inmates doing it due to lack of other options.
The text even suggests some people might prefer their mates seek outside sex over masturbation.
It claims this can be due to their own guilt or fear of their mate's repugnance, and even surprisingly, a vicarious thrill from the mate having sex with others, although this is seldom admitted.
Wow. The source is quite cynical about the hidden motivations behind sexual norms and guilt. It gives a specific reason why religion declares masturbation sinful.
It argues it's a natural act people will do anyway, and causing guilt around it is part of a malicious scheme to obligate atonement, forcing people to pay mortgages on temples of abstinence through confession or other means.
Control through guilt.
That's the argument, and modern shame persists even without overt religious guilt.
How so?
Yes. The source suggests modern individuals feel shame yielding to masturbatory desires. Men may feel a loss of masculinity. Women may yearn for the ego gratification of being seduced. Both might prefer an inadequate partner over masturbation.
Interesting dynamic.
But the satanic view presented is that it's far better to engage in a perfect fantasy than to cooperate in an unrewarding experience with another person. With masturbation, you have complete control of the situation.
Control and perfect fantasy.
It's presented as a normal, healthy act.
Right.
The text states it's performed by all animals and human children unless they are scolded and taught guilt. It advocates for exposing the past moral code as a pragmatically organized set of rules which would destroy us. It promotes emancipation from ridiculous standards, including those of the sexual revolution, and adhering to the sensible and humanistic new morality of Satanism to raise children without devastating moral encumbrances.
So, satanic sex, is presented here, isn't about forced transgression, but about honest self-awareness, acknowledging individual needs and desires, prioritizing consent, and using sexual energy, including autoerotic, as a natural force for personal fulfillment and magical working, free from external guilt.
That's the core message on this topic. According to the source, a focus on individual freedom and honesty about one's nature within a framework of not harming the unwilling.
Let's move on to another unique concept in this text: psychic vampires.
This is a fascinating and somewhat chilling section. The source defines psychic vampires as individuals who drain energy and ambition from others through guilt and manipulation.
Energy drainers. How does this source describe their methods?
They operate subtly, often through hints rather than direct demands. The text gives examples like, "Oh, I couldn't ask you to do that," using reverse psychology to get you to insist on helping them.
The subtle manipulation.
Their sins are not of commission, but of omission. They avoid making overt demands to avoid resentment, but let their wishes be known subtly to prevent being seen as pests.
It sounds like they prey on a person's sense of duty or kindness.
Precisely. The source lists their attributes as often being invalids, real or feigned, mentally emotionally disturbed, or feigning ignorance and competence to elicit pity or exasperated help.
And who do they typically target?
The text says they choose conscientious, responsible people, those dedicated to their moral obligations.
The good people.
Yeah. They target individuals relatively content and satisfied with their lives, happily married, successful in their jobs, well-adjusted because they are lacking all the things his victim has and want to disrupt that happiness.
The source also mentions group psychic vampires.
Yes, identifying fundraising organizations, charities, and some religious or fraternal groups as examples. They achieve this by selecting a chairman skilled in making others feel guilty, intimidating people into opening their hearts and then their wallets.
Ugh.
The text cynically notes these chairmen often draw a salary for their noble deeds and are masters at exploiting the sympathy of responsible people, even using children for donations.
The text does acknowledge the difficulty for a conscientious person in distinguishing this from genuine charity.
It notes it's hard to tell voluntary from imposed charity. The text advises prioritizing obligations to friends, family, and community first, and crucially, including yourself among those who mean most.
Put your own oxygen mask on first.
Kind of, yeah. Before donating externally, evaluate what you can afford without depriving those closest, and critically assess the validity of the request and the asker's motives.
Saying no is presented as a necessary defense.
It is. The text says it's very difficult if you've always said yes, but essential to prevent being exploited. Psychic vampires, if allowed, will gradually infiltrate your everyday life until you have no privacy left, and your constant feeling of concern for them will deplete you of all ambition.
Sounds exhausting. How does the source advise identifying an individual psychic vampire?
The text says they seem to have no real friends or interests except you. They might claim to be highly selective with friends, but you are presented as the outstanding exception.
The special one.
This is attributed to their inability to give of himself to acquire and keep friends.
It contrasts this with functional relationships, too.
Yes, it clarifies that functional relationships involve give and take. Psychic vampires, the text claims, often give material gifts specifically to create obligation, binding you to them.
Gifts with strings attached.
Exactly. They want obligation, not material repayment, and would resent being paid back materially. It's described as selling your soul, and they remind you of your duty by not reminding you explicitly. Subtle guilt trips.
So what is the recommended purely satanic way to deal with these psychic vampires according to the source?
It's to play dumb.
Play dumb.
Act as if they are genuinely altruistic and expect nothing in return. The text advises to teach them a lesson, graciously take what they give you, thanking them loudly enough for all to hear, and walking away.
Just taking a run, basically.
And then, when they expect repayment, graciously say no. The source says they will first act crushed, hoping guilt works, but then show their true colors by becoming angry and vindictive.
It's a strategy to expose their manipulation by refusing to be controlled by guilt, leaving them with only anger as a response.
It advocates for focusing on reciprocal relationships and discarding those who are destructive drainers, concentrating on people who appreciate your responsibility and reciprocate that feeling.
Makes sense.
The section ends with a direct, sharp warning to psychic vampires. Beware of the Satanist. He is ready and willing to gleefully drive the proverbial stake through your heart.
A definitive and unforgiving stance against those who drain others. Let's move to another core concept, indulgence, not compulsion. The source calls the awareness of the flesh the highest plateau of human development.
Yes, that's a foundational statement for this idea. According to the text, Satanism encourages followers to indulge in their natural desires, asserting that only by doing so can this highest plateau be reached. It distinguishes indulgence, choice, gratifying desires, from compulsion, lack of choice, driven by force.
And it claims that repressed desires become compulsions.
Precisely. Proper release through indulgence prevents this. The text argues that periodic indulgence, done in a particular time and place without fear or guilt, leads to an unfrustrated life, allowing individuals to pursue undertakings wholeheartedly instead of being held back.
Are there exceptions mentioned?
The text acknowledges that some people, particularly in artistic fields, may work better under pressure, and that fulfillment can exist through self-denial, linking this to masochism.
Okay.
However, it focuses on the perceived injustice faced by the average middle-class worker.
What is that injustice?
The source argues that the average worker who pays society's bills and upholds moral obligations is the one most often lacking release and is condemned for normally indulging in his natural desires.
And how does Satanism view this?
It sees it as a gross injustice. The text states that those who uphold societal responsibility should be most entitled to the pleasures of his choice, without censure from the society he serves.
So reward the responsible with pleasure.
Satanism is presented as commending and rewarding these supporters of society instead of condemning their natural human needs. It even draws a controversial parallel, extracting the principle of strength through joy from the madness of the Hitlerian concept.
Right, that's a very loaded reference.
As an example of offering personal happiness to ensure loyalty and efficiency.
That's a controversial point, extracting a principle from such a source. How does the text justify drawing inspiration from that specific idea?
Well, the text doesn't explicitly justify why it draws from that specific source, but it presents the principle of strength through joy itself as a shining example of motivating people through personal happiness to achieve societal goals like loyalty and efficiency. It contrasts this with systems that preach self-denial for those who uphold society. It's presented very pragmatically, focusing on the outcome of the motivational principle rather than its historical origin.
Okay, pragmatic but still jarring. The text also links frustration to physical and mental health issues.
It asserts that the majority of illnesses are psychosomatic, a direct result of frustration. It flips the saying, "the good die young," arguing that it's true by Christian standards because the frustration of natural instincts leads to bodily deterioration and premature death.
Interesting twist on that phrase.
Yeah.
And it critiques the focus on the mind and spirit over the body.
Neglecting the body, which it calls the very shell without which the mind and spirit could not exist, is deemed coarse, crude, unrefined.
Farce.
It mocks modern, emancipated people who leave normalcy for idiocy, like solely eating brown rice and tea in pursuit of spiritual development. The Satanist, by contrast, is described as preferring a good, hearty meal, using imagination, and achieving transcendence through physical and emotional fulfillment, welcoming the chance to be fully human.
Embrace the physical. It even addresses masochism within this framework of indulgence.
Satanism, as presented, sees masochism as a form of indulgence if attempts to change it are met with resentment or failure. It doesn't condemn it, but expresses contempt towards those who cannot be honest enough, at least with themselves, to face and accept their masochism.
Honesty with oneself, again. There's also a critique of what the text calls sour grapes religionists.
These are people who admit to having natural desires but still label them as shameful, expressing a wish to temper sinful desires.
Right.
The Satanist questions why desires are considered shameful if admitted to be natural, suggesting these religionists may fear enjoying themselves or losing followers if people realize Satanism is enjoyable and consistent with their true feelings.
A challenge to religious motivations there. The text contrasts the white magician's use of animal sacrifice with the satanic view on releasing magical force.
The white magician is described as using birds or lower creatures for sacrifice, feeling no guilt for non-human life. However, the text argues that the true magical force release is not in spilling blood,
Not the blood.
but in the death throes, the discharge of bioelectrical energy, or, more importantly, in the profound heightening of emotions, like sexual orgasm, blind anger, mortal terror, or consuming grief.
And these powerful, readily available emotions are exactly those often labeled sinful by religionists.
Yes. The text calls white magicians mystical cowards who would chop the head off a goat or chicken to harness its dying agony rather than have the blasphemous bravery to masturbate in view of the Jehovah they deny.
Wow, direct attack.
They seek release through another's death, proxy, rather than through the indulgent force which produces life. The text concludes with a striking dismissal. The treaders of the path of white light are truly the cold and the dead, and dramatically adds, one good orgasm would probably kill them.
That's an incredibly harsh critique, accusing them of hypocrisy, repression, and emotional sterility. This brings us to a controversial topic mentioned in the source: human sacrifice. The text defines who is considered fit and proper.
The answer given is presented as brutally simple. Anyone who has unjustly wronged you, specifically someone who has gone out of his way to hurt you or those dear to you.
So an enemy.
In short, a person asking to be cursed by their very actions. The text frames it as a moral obligation to indulge them their wish.
So the human sacrifice here refers not to a ritualistic killing of an innocent, but to directing a curse or destructive force against someone who has wronged you.
Exactly, based on the text's definition. It describes the ideal human sacrifice as a misdirected masochist.
A misdirected masochist.
This is a person who picks on others mistakenly called sadistic, but is actually working towards their own destruction because they are afraid or resentful of your happiness, weak and insecure. They are on extremely shaky ground when you direct your curse, making them ideal human sacrifices.
And the source rejects common excuses for these harmful actions.
It forcefully states that mental illness, anxiety, neuroses, etc. are convenient excuses for vicious and irresponsible actions. The text rejects the idea that we must try to understand those who make others miserable,
No empathy for the aggressor.
calling it aiding and abetting a social cancer. It concludes that since they make you miserable, they deserve to be miserable twice.
That is an unforgiving and retributive stance, firmly rooted in the principle of getting what you deserve, and perhaps then some. Let's look at the concept of life after death, which the source views through fulfillment of the ego.
The text notes that man is aware of death, unlike animals who only know when it's certain and accept it gracefully when unavoidable. It then critiques the belief in reincarnation.
Why does it critique reincarnation?
It sees it as appealing to those who have nothing in this life, may have been a king, be one in next, serving a need for self-respect.
Escapism.
Kind of. It questions why, if ancestors had good karmas, the believer is currently in privation. Reincarnation is framed as providing a fantasy world for ego expression, while claiming the ego is dissolved, noting how people choose fantasy alter egos in past lives.
The Satanist belief, however, is different.
The Satanist, according to the source, believes in complete gratification of his ego now. Satanism is presented as the only religion advocating the intensification or encouragement of the ego.
Focus on the ego now.
The text argues that only with a sufficiently fulfilled ego can a person afford to be truly kind to others without robbing himself of his self-respect. A braggart is seen as having an impoverished ego needing satisfaction.
So kindness and generosity are framed not as virtues achieved through self-denial, but as a capacity that comes from having a strong, fulfilled ego.
That's the interpretation presented. It flows from personal strength and satisfaction, not from traditional altruism or humility. Finally, the source discusses the highest holiday in the system.
And that would be
Your own birthday.
your birthday.
The text states it's the most important holiday of the year. It questions why celebrate figures you've never met or historical dates more than your own birth. It encourages celebrating yourself like the king or god that you are, buying what you want with pomp and ceremony.
That perfectly encapsulates the focus on the self, the ego, and the embrace of life in the here and now that runs through this entire philosophy as presented in the excerpts.
It's the ultimate personal holiday, centering the individual's existence and worth above all external figures or historical events.
So we've taken a thorough deep dive into the ideas presented in these excerpts from Anton LaVey's The Satanic Bible. We've explored his philosophy of self-indulgence, the rejection of traditional guilt and morality, the practical and symbolic nature of satanic magic aimed at mastery of the earth.
The greater and lesser magic.
The different types of rituals focused on channeling intense emotion, the critiques of religious hypocrisy, and these unique perspectives on sex, love, hate, psychic vampires, and even what the source calls human sacrifice.
We've seen how this system, as presented here, fundamentally emphasizes living life fully in the present, embracing natural instincts and desires, questioning all external authority, and focusing squarely on personal power and tangible earthly success.
Right.
It's laid out as a deliberate and radical challenge to many widely held beliefs and a stark call to self-reliance and, in a sense, self-worship.
Absolutely. It presents a worldview that deliberately inverts many conventional values. So, reflecting on this exploration of a philosophy centered on self-interest, the embrace of desires often labeled sinful, and a focus on tangible earthly results, as presented in these excerpts. Consider this. In a world that increasingly emphasizes individual well-being, personal happiness, self-care, and even concepts like manifesting desires and pursuing personal success, how different are these core tenets in practical application from the unacknowledged motivations that drive many of us today?
That's the question for you to mull over, having explored the specific ideas laid out in this source material.